Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with somebody who definitely had a profound effect on our culture, Art Paul, who died recently at the age of 93, a Chicago boy from the Southwest Side, moved up to Rogers Park, went to Sullivan High School, and became one of the top graphic designers in the country. But more importantly, he became the art director for Playboy under Hugh Hefner in 1953, and it was he who designed the iconic bunny logo. Here is graphic designer James Goggin talking about Art Paul at the 25th anniversary Chicago Humanities Festival in 2014.
Art was born on the southwest side of Chicago. He later moved to the Rogers Park neighborhood, where he attended the Roger C. Sullivan High School and met an art teacher who thought him gifted enough to earn a scholarship at the Art Institute of Chicago. Then World War II summoned him, and after a stint in the Army Air Corps, Art became aware of what was going on at the Institute of Design as Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's new Bauhaus came to be called, and he chose to enroll in the ID. His work as an art director at Playboy, his own commercial design and illustration work post-Playboy, and his continuing art practice have all drawn acclaim, awards, and exhibitions. In 1980, Paul was elected a member of the Alliance Graphique Internationale. The Institute of Design, IIT, honored him with its Professional Achievement Award in 1983, and in 1986 he was elected to the Hall of Fame of the Art Directors Club. He received the Herb Lubalin Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Publication Designers, and in 2008 was made a Fellow of the Chicago chapter of the American Institute of Graphic Arts. The Society of Typographic Arts gave him a special award for outstanding achievement in trademark design for the Playboy rabbit head symbol. The Art Directors Club of Boston gave him an award for inspiring, encouraging, and creating an outstanding showcase for contemporary artists. The Art Directors of Philadelphia awarded him the Polycube Award for consistent excellence in communications. The City of Milan in Italy awarded Art with its gold medal for the exhibition Beyond Illustration, and the Art Direction magazine gave Paul the first award in its publishing history for interest and support of illustration and illustrators and the tremendous range of illustrative styles that run in Playboy magazine. But that's only scratching the surface of all of the awards and recognitions that Art has received over the years. In late 1953, this is what changed everything. A Chicago copywriter from Esquire named Hugh Marston Hefner walked into Art's office on Van Buren looking for an art director for the magazine he was developing, and he had learned of Art Paul through a mutual acquaintance. Hefner's intention was originally just to approach Art to commission a few illustrations, but he was immediately struck by all of the work on Art's studio walls. And asked Art if all of this experimental material on the walls was Art's work, is this your work, or is this work that you like? And Art just replied, both. A lot of Art's own work on the walls happened to be for projects that clients had rejected either for being too flamboyant or too hip for the tastes at the time. But for Hefner, this was exactly what he was looking for. Someone who could do that work, but also knew that work in order to commission other people to do it as well. The perfect definition of an art director. By no means the definitive age of Art's work, but really a huge impact on American culture, on Art himself, and on the field of art direction and illustration as a whole. In 1953, putting together the first issue, Hugh Hefner worked on it in his kitchen table. Art ultimately, despite reservations, decided, okay, I'm going to take this on, was working on the magazine from his studio. Reason for some of the reservations was, at the time, Hefner planned to call the magazine Stag Party. The initial dummy, which was designed by a cartoonist and resembled kind of movie star and screen magazines of the time, nothing completely radical. Hefner knew that he wanted something different, more innovative and sophisticated, but he didn't quite know how to get that. So together with Art Paul, he now had his man, and they worked on creating the very first issue. Art himself recalls, Hef was very insistent on this Stag Party as a name. I told him it was madness. There was already an outdoor magazine at the time called Stag, so ultimately I believe they received a cease and desist to not call the magazine Stag Party, so it was fortuitous. And they were therefore tasked of thinking of alternative titles. The animal theme kind of stuck with it. They got rid of Stag, came up with Playboy, which was ultimately coined by Eldon Sellers, one of Hefner's founding associates, who went on to become a company executive of Playboy. And having decided on the word Playboy, it took about 1 hour for Art to sketch the famous rabbit profile with the cock deer and the tuxedo tie. Art intended originally for the symbol to be used as a characteristic endpoint to the articles, but those plans changed, and the rabbit head instead became Playboy's corporate visual identity and a running theme for the issue's covers.
I'd also refer you to our Hugh Hefner podcast, which we did a couple years back. We're going to move on now to our feature, Gustav Born, who died recently at the age of 97. What an amazing man and an amazing story. He's one of the last links to the German Jewish intelligentsia who fled Germany when Hitler came to power before World War II. His father was Max Born, who was a Nobel Laureate in quantum physics, and he was 11 years old when his father took his family out of Germany and moved to Edinburgh. The work that Max Born did helped develop the atomic bomb. He didn't help directly, but in his lab was J. Robert Oppenheimer, who studied under him. And the ironic thing is that Gustav Born was one of the first Britons to visit Hiroshima after the first atomic bomb, and he noticed that Japanese patients were dying of uncontrolled bleeding because the radiation had suppressed their bone marrows and decreased their platelet counts, platelets being necessary for blood coagulation. Gustav Born became a pharmacologist and became one of the leading experts in the world on platelets and blood coagulation. Here's Matthew Bannister, the BBC4 Last Word on Gustav Born.
Gustav Born was the eminent pharmacologist whose pioneering work on blood clotting improved the prevention and diagnosis of thrombosis. He held prestigious appointments at the Royal College of Surgeons, Cambridge University and King's College London. He was also an honorary fellow of St. Peter's College, Oxford. Gustav Born started his life in an eminent Jewish family in Göttingen in central Germany. We spoke to his daughter, Georgina Born, and to the master of St. Peter's College, Mark Damazer.
His father, Max Born, was the Nobel Prize winner for his work in quantum theory. Gus was born in a family that was familiar with Einstein and all the great German scientists.
He grew up lying under the piano while his father played marvellous music. There's a famous story of his father playing piano and violin sonatas with Einstein, and Einstein fluffs something and Max Born stops and said, "Einstein, why can't you count?" I think his whole life was to do with the struggle of being the son of a very, very famous scientist. Of course, the irony is he turned out to be a considerable scientist himself.
He was part of that wave of immigration that happened in the 1930s, people fleeing from Adolf Hitler, coming to the United Kingdom. Where did the family settle when they arrived in the UK?
They moved to Edinburgh and settled there very happily.
My father said to me, "Why don't you study medicine? Then you will not have to kill people in the war, and you are less likely to be killed yourself."
He trained in medicine in Edinburgh and qualified in his early 20s and was immediately sent to war and eventually ended up being sent into Hiroshima. He was overwhelmed.
We and 3 of our other doctors there were the first British people to go to Hiroshima, and that left an impression that has, of course, never left me.
One of the things he observed was how many people who hadn't been killed by the blast were slowly bleeding to death because their capacity to clot had been destroyed.
And amongst the patients, the people whom we had to look after, were hundreds of Japanese who had survived the bomb from around Hiroshima, but who were bleeding unstoppably.
This led him to this lifelong interest, really, in the mechanisms of blood clotting and to his scientific work on platelet aggregation.
And tell us more about that, because he made some significant breakthroughs, didn't he?
Yes, he himself started his own research career in the 50s after his PhD. He focused very much on mechanisms of platelet clotting, and he developed a particular technique, now known as the Born aggregometer. It helps you to both visualize and measure the rate at which platelets come together, aggregate.
But what's interesting about that is it simply never occurred to him to patent it. I once asked him why he had chosen not to do that, and it came back to this overpowering sense of public duty and the need to do good, and he would have regarded it as risible to have got some commercial advantage out of something that had done so much good for mankind. He simply wasn't in his field of vision to have thought of it in that way.
Often now people take aspirin in order to thin their blood. Was that one of the things that came from his research?
I think the capacity to measure what happens when you apply different drugs, including aspirin, to potential clotting, that definitely came out of his work and his techniques.
He was also a talented flautist, I gather.
Yeah, he was earlier in his life. He could have become a professional flautist at Oxford and after. I think as time went on, he found it sort of impossible to combine these two things.
He turned up at student concerts, and I have this picture of Gus coming in to listen to the Matthew Passion. There was a very touching moment. The then director of music had finished conducting, and Gus presented him with the score, which was in the Born family collection of the Brahms Lieder. And in that was inserted some correspondence between members of the Born family from Max's generation and Brahms himself. And it was the most touching gift, which the director of music was moved to tears by. I think one thing that's really poignant about the death of Gus is it may be one of the very last, if not the last, of this tremendous wave of immigration that came into Britain in the 1930s from Central Europe, Germany and Austria. George Weidenfeld, Hugh Hefner, Herman Bondi, Ernst Gombrich. I mean, these were people of astonishing intellectual and cultural ability, and they came and made their life in Britain and contributed enormously to it. And one by one, they've been passing away in the last few years, and I don't know that there are many left of them. And they got out just in time and gave a huge amount to the United Kingdom.
We're going to make a brief mention of Michael Anderson, who died recently at the age of 98, British film director. He directed the British film The Dam Busters, which is a classic in Britain, but he's better known in the United States for his 1956 Tour de Force, a Michael Todd film, Around the World in 80 Days, which won the Best Picture in 1957. He was nominated as the Best Director, but he lost to George Stevens in Giant. It was the last picture Michael Todd made before he died in a plane crash, and here's a little bit of the trailer.
It's a wonderful world if you'll only take the time to go around it.
Are you formally challenging me to undertake a journey around the world in 80 days?
I say this is absurd.
Gentlemen, I have on deposits at Barings Bank the sum of £20,000, and I'm willing to wager any or all of it upon the same contention, namely that I can complete a tour of the world in 80 days.
Michael Todd's Around the World in 80 Days.
20 years later, he did his other memorable American picture, Logan's Run, a dystopic science fiction epic with some of my favorite actors, including Michael York, Richard Jordan, Jenny Agutter, and a young Farrah Fawcett.
Just imagine a world where you will hold your entire future in the palm of your hand, when a tiny glowing crystal will guide you through an existence in which each day is more wonderful than the last, where it will be possible for you to obtain the fulfillment of every fantasy, the satisfaction of every vanity, the absolute attainment of every wish.
Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer presents the Saul David production of Logan's Run, a fantastic journey through a world beyond imagination. Welcome to the 23rd century.
Well, we're going to close tonight with the death of number 16, who died at the age of 43. She was the world's oldest known living spider. This is from the ABC, Australian news site. Australia has a notorious reputation as home to some of the world's deadliest creatures, and until recently also harbored the oldest known living spider in the world. The trapdoor matriarch named number 16 died at the ripe old age of 43 during a long-term population study in Western Australia's central wheat belt, and far outlived her previous rival, a 28-year-old Mexican tarantula. Curtin University's Leanda Mason said the arachnid's significant life had allowed scientists to further investigate the behavior and population dynamics of trapdoor spiders. The research project was started by renowned University of Western Australian biologist and spider specialist Barbara York Main in 1974. Number 16 was discovered in Professor Main's original survey in that year. Through Barbara's detailed research, we were able to determine that the extensive lifespan of the trapdoor spider is due to their life history traits, including how they live in uncleared native bushland, their sedentary nature, and low metabolisms, Mrs. Mason said. Professor Main's research has shown that the male trapdoor spider leaves his burrow at maturity, around 7 to 9 years old, to wander in search of a mate, after which he dies. The female stays put, raising hatchlings inside the protection of her burrow, which she temporarily seals up with a mud plug. She lives on in the same burrow for the duration of her life. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. And as a final tribute to number 16, we're going to play a little bit of a story of another spider. This song was written by John Entwistle in 1966 for The Who, and this is about Boris the spider.
He's crawling up my wall, black and hairy, very small. Now he's up above my head, hanging by a little thread. Boris the spider, Boris the spider. sky.